Thank you, Peter, and thank you very much to Peter and the original Politics in the Pub group for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk, and especially to people like your good selves. I mean, we're all in this together. As Peter said, that it is rather unnerving. I've just come back from Canberra this morning. I was at that press conference yesterday with Bernard Collaery, and I will mention Bernard. But however, I've prepared this using some of the material in my recent PhD thesis, which I've just passed, really. You're never too old. You're never too old to study. I haven't got the floppy hat yet, but I intend to get it. But a lot of things concern me, and as I'm sure they concern you, but however, we'll do it together. Now, so it's war memorials or truth-telling, and we know that the War Memorial in Canberra is to undergo refurbishment, which is said to cost around about $500 million. Wow. This is in addition to more than that much again spent on commemorating Anzac since 2014. On top of this, Australia is seeking to become one of the top 10 arms dealers in the world. To the outset, I say, I haven't got much problem with countries protecting themselves. But once it gets to arms dealing and trying to be one of the top 10, that is beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. Now, regarding the memorial, it was reported in June this year that there are plans to commemorate those involved in turning back asylum seekers by boat in the memorial. It was reported in the Australian, actually. Now, as I've just heard, gasps of consternation, and that has been the response. But the War Memorial Director, Brendan Nelson, has responded that the memorial is completely apolitical, he says. This is an institution that is free of party politics. He also said that the story of persons engaged in border protection should be recognised alongside those involved in military engagements, such as our diggers, and those in peacekeeping operations. Well, I'll leave you to think about that. But this is some more information. Some of the donors to the War Memorial existing at the moment, but also willing to come on board with this refurbishment, are groups like BAE Systems, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, among a list of many other arms manufacturers. Nelson said that while he doesn't hold arms manufacturers responsible for the deaths of civilians, he thinks the companies do have an obligation to help to tell the stories of wars that they have weaponised. Thus, the remembrance of those who died in war continues the subtle but age-old change into mythic narratives which champion dominant groups and rewrite history in their favour. Now, my thesis that I've just finished was based on the philosophy of René Girard. You ought to Google him, a wonderful man. I am so pleased I live at this time where the thought of René Girard is starting to infiltrate our cultures. He demonstrated the power, but also the underlying weakness of the myths, those myths and others. In his view, myth-making is the effort of dominant groups to narrate episodes of victimisation from their point of view. This has been part of human experience, in his view, from the time we crawled out of the slime. The sense of threat engenders the determination to blame and punish. If the blame and punishment are directed too readily to the internal group, the violence generated could lead the group to extinction. Therefore, an entity somewhat removed is preferable to blame. A foreigner, perhaps, someone weaker, somebody with a disability. This one replaces the all, so that instead of all against all, to try to find the answer to the violence of the internal group, it is displaced onto one. And of course, it's classic scapegoating. And I'm terribly sorry. Maybe I should hold this. Yeah, maybe I should hold it. And in fact, if I hold it, I'd rather stand, to tell you the truth. I'm a teacher and I have never I have never taught sitting down. And I never used to let the teachers do it either. If you can cope with me with this, do this piece of paper. Okay, good. Okay, so we've got the thing about the scapegoat, the weak one to take the blame and punishment for whatever's causing a crisis in the dominant group. And of course the scapegoat, lacking the means of self-defence, therefore will probably not engender any revenge, so therefore there's less likelihood of more violence. So the group is safe. So in Girard's view, I find his work fascinating. He says the ancient myths are disguised accounts of scapegoating. He wrote at length of Greek and Roman myths, Indian and South American myths, all the myths. And in them he detected some sort of crisis, some internal rivalry or strife, or a natural disaster, as a result of which relationships break down, normal avenues of operation collapse, people fight each other, violence becomes a threat. Someone has to be blamed. Someone has to bear the weight of whatever problems are causing the threat. Victims are chosen or manufactured to take this role. They are sacrificed, murdered, expelled, chucked off a cliff, whatever it takes. Having joined together to blame someone, harmony is restored until the next time a crisis occurs. Now, he called this the victim mechanism, and the success of the victim mechanism is really a two-edged affair. It's amazing. First, the sacrifice of the victim brings the crisis to an end because at last someone is found to be blamed and it's not us. Then, because it was the victim who brought about such harmony in the group, suddenly the victim is seen as more than human and even godlike. Anyway, we won't go into that, but it's hugely interesting. These narratives have been woven around the fireside for millennia, told and retold. The perspective always exonerates the dominant group, the murdering group, and paints the victims as the cause of the problems. But then in a narrative like Anzac, the young victims sent to shore up Australia's place and protection in the British Empire are gradually deified. We use them again and again to achieve harmony and national cohesion, and we bask in the glory that we create. I want to quote here a paragraph by Don Watson in an amazing article he wrote a couple of years ago, 2014, called "Lest We Go Over the Top." It's really worth reading. This is Don's words. The experience of war very much depends on where one happens to be standing at the time. This is true for those whose fate is decided in battle, and for those who, having sent them to fight, watch from an expedient hillside. It is also true for those who come later, writers of all descriptions who go on scavenging among the dead and wounded long after they are dust, and base members of the political horde who fashion convenience from their memory and make them cannon fodder a second time in culture wars. And then there are we citizens, ever willing to sun ourselves in a myth's reflected glory. This is his last sentence in this paragraph. War is horrible, so horrible we would... I'll say his sentence again. War is horrible, so horrible, without it we would not know ourselves. Now, I'm happy I live in a time where, despite the sometime outrageous behaviour of people in power, we have the ability to see through the lie that is scapegoating. It is a downright lie. And I'm with René Girard on this. His studies of myth brought him to the Jewish and Christian scriptures where, despite their mythic overlays, a single fact was gradually made clear. The victim is innocent, and the scapegoaters are the ones who are guilty. This truth is still dawning on us, obvious from the fact that our societies still attempt scapegoating. But we can recognise what's going on and we can challenge it. And I believe that's one of the reasons we're all here tonight, because we can see through this lie. Asylum seekers in Australia and refugees on Manus Island and Nauru fit Girard's criteria of the scapegoat perfectly. They are arbitrary victims, blamed as illegal despite not having committed crimes. They are incarcerated as deterrents by authorities who face an unprecedented worldwide refugee crisis. They have no redress. Fear, secrecy, false accusation and silence combine to maintain this group as a group of hostages, which presents an image of a strong and protective government appealing to large sections of a fearful electorate. The story of their victimisation is distorted to paint the dominant group as heroes, protecting our borders and even getting a place in the War Memorial. Now, the Timorese people have also fitted the criteria of Australian scapegoat during our shared history. In relation to the War Memorial, the absence of proper acknowledgement of the World War II Timor campaign in that institution, alongside the intention to honour the border force, shows how politicised our war memorialisation has become, as will be discussed. But friends, it's actually more than that, I believe. The treatment of the Timorese and of asylum seekers and of others who are scapegoated by Australia, for example at yesterday's events regarding Bernard Collaery, are examples of violence which is at the heart of victimisation. It is violence which is the human institution which seeks to control us. Now, regarding Bernard Collaery, I do want to say something about him. Now, there are many views around, and I want to really find out about this, but perhaps the government's thinking goes like this, perhaps. What if lawyers and others act on behalf of their clients in a way which challenges the increasing number of laws we are installing in the name of national security? What a crisis that would be. We must find a victim, someone whose pursuit will be a graphic example of what will happen should the increasing weight of legislation be opposed. We already have a couple, Witness K and his lawyer Bernard Collaery. They are connected to Timor, that perpetual pebble in our shoe. We will trash their reputations, force them to a secret court, threaten their livelihood and implicate them in the crisis which we generated by spying on Timorese negotiators when we put the bugs in the walls of the Timorese Prime Minister's office when we were generously refurbing a ship under an AusAid program. We will risk the ire of the Australian population because with an emasculated ABC and a compliant Murdoch media empire, they will move on to the next circus or crisis. How true are Renee Girard's words? Politics is part of violence, not violence part of politics. I find that very, very interesting. I want to outline tonight another example of scapegoating which affects the War Memorial. And it's the example of the Timor campaign in World War II, and I devote a whole chapter in my thesis to this. So this is just a summary. I look at it in Girard's terms as the scapegoating of a smaller and weaker entity for the purpose of addressing the crisis of Australian fear. This episode has victimisation has links to the continuing belief among many Australians that Australia was going to be invaded by the Japanese, and during which our soldiers made a valiant effort not only to save Australia but to save Timor. Now there's two huge myths there. The unfounded belief in the threat of Japanese invasion remains. I still meet people who really think that we were going to be invaded. Now, I do acknowledge, and among the people I acknowledge are my parents actually, but because it's only those who experience the deep-seated fear and expectation of a Japanese invasion could really appreciate the situation of Australia in 1942. I don't want to gloss over that at all. People at the time actually believed this was going to happen. They were embroiled in a world war and their traditional support from Britain was weakened because of Singapore. They inhabited a vast and undefended landmass and having no knowledge to the contrary, which was actually kept from them for months, believed that we were going to be engulfed by Japan's southward march. Australians feared for their nation and for their lives. This fear of invasion plugged into the fear which had inhabited the Australian psyche for many, many decades. Dr. Peter Stanley, who used to be in charge of the War Memorial, he said, for more than a century, Australians have frightened themselves repeatedly with stories and novels depicting imaginary invasions. Much of this fear centred on possible Asian invasion, with Japan featuring strongly as a central issue. Yet now it is accepted by historians that the primary reason for Japan's expansionist push southwards was to establish what they called the Great Southeast Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was to stretch from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese did not intend to invade Australia. Evidence of this lack of invasion plans were detailed in the Australian official war history in 1957. It is there for us all to read. In fact, Japan was careful regarding Japan's invasion of Timor, which of course happened. Japan was very careful not to invade any of the possessions of Portugal. Portugal played an important political role in the international community during the war because it was neutral. Lisbon was the base for operatives of all sides to collect and share information. The Japanese administration therefore chose not to target the Portuguese colonies of Macau and Timor. James Dunn writes, evidently the Germans were apprehensive that any Japanese move against a Portuguese territory would provoke Lisbon into offering the Allies base facilities in the Azores, a move that would deal a severe blow to U-boat operations against Allied shipping. Complicated. Suggestions of invading Australia among the Japanese did surface, but only in lower naval ranks. The army wouldn't have a bar of it. The Japanese army wouldn't. They said it would require 10 divisions to invade Australia and that their forces were already stretched in Burma and China. And Prime Minister Tojo, just before he was executed in 1948, he said there were never any plans to invade Australia. The attacks against the Australian mainland, Darwin, Katherine, all those places up there, and the foray into Sydney were designed to isolate the nation from its allies, to prevent the use of strategic positions by the United States, and to put psychological pressure on the Australians. The Australians who bravely and skillfully fought in New Guinea did so against an enemy who was attempting to cripple Australia, not to invade it. However desperate the fear of the Australian population, the subsequent tragedy was not primarily felt by Australians. It was Timor that was invaded, not Australia. Official communications of the time saw the Australian incursion into Portuguese Timor in December 1941 as crucial to the protection of Australia. How on earth a small force of 700 men was supposed to accomplish that feat was not made clear. Amazingly, despite the evidence that the Japanese were not going to invade Australia, just in 2008 the government instituted what's called the Battle for Australia Day, which continues to perpetrate this idea that we were going to be invaded. And it paints Australia as the victim, whereas the actual victims, the Timorese, are forgotten. Now, friends, I'm just going to briefly go through the story because the story needs to be told and retold. I'm bringing coals to Newcastle here, but I still want to tell the story, and I know you tell the story as well. We need to tell it again. There were just a few hundred Australian commandos sent into Timor in December 1941 against the express wishes of the Portuguese administration. They did not want them there, and in protest they moved their whole administration out to the island of Atura. Because the Australians had already gone in, then the Japanese relinquished their sensitivity about Portugal's neutrality and invaded Timor in February 1942. And of course we must remember, it was the 19th of February 1942. The day Darwin was bombed was the day Dilley was bombed. But in all our celebrations, do we ever hear that? The Australians, assisted by many Timorese, conducted a guerrilla campaign for 14 months against far greater numbers of Japanese troops. At first there were 1,000 Japanese, then another 4,000 were inserted, and by the end of the war there was nearly a whole division of Japanese on Timor because of the success of the Australians, who never numbered more than 700 at any one time. Of course, it was the Timorese assistance to the Australians that allowed them to be so successful. It was a two-way partnership. The Timorese could see what fabulous soldiers they were, and the Timorese, the Australians depended on the Timorese. Paul Cleary's excellent book, The Men Who Came Out of the Ground, he says that when all other Allied resistance in Asia had ceased to exist, this small group of Australians showed that the all-conquering Japanese could be matched and beaten. So actually on Timor, it was the only group of Allied soldiers that kept operating, and of course that was because of the help of the Timorese. Now, the Australians withdrew early in 1943, so they're only there for about 14 months, and leaving the Timorese without any support. This allowed the Japanese complete control, and as I said, there was nearly a whole division, up to 20,000 Japanese who were there, and it was their reprisals against the Timorese which caused so much death and suffering. But it wasn't only Japanese reprisals. It was also Allied bombing. Our Hudsons were going over, bombing, because there were a few Australians left there to tell defence signals where to bomb, and the Americans were bombing as well. So we were involved in the deaths. The conservative estimate of Timorese deaths in World War II is 40,000. Jim Dunn puts it as high as 70,000 because the 40,000 actually doesn't take any account of natural, natural increase. Now, friends, the Australian record of all this in my book is a myth, an attempt to write another myth. Australian governments forget this unique wartime narrative. The presentation of the history of the Timor campaign in books, films, the Australian War Memorial, and on the internet usually ignores facts or fails to make connections required to influence Australian people's understanding of the place of Timor in the war. It's as though they didn't exist. The available record both reflects and feeds the general ignorance, distorting the facts and maintaining romantic illusions of Australian heroism, forgetting the Timorese. The Australian record is a modern-day myth. The Timorese were, in fact, sacrificed at a moment of perceived Australian peril. They were the victims in that crisis, a small, defenceless entity used without thought or interest for Australian protection. But of course, we can see through the scapegoating, and many Australians do, and there have been wonderful displays lately, grassroots Australian efforts, photographic exhibitions, displays of this one kind or another, to try to educate the population about the Timorese war effort. These accounts testify to the unveiling of the scapegoat mechanism and show that the dominant group's desire to protect itself meant the sacrifice of a smaller entity, which was actually treated as a non-entity. These exhibitions combine to present the narrative of a feat which has few parallels, in that the Australians, with the sustained support of the local people, ensured that they were the only Allied force which remained viable in South Asia at the time. In contrast to these resources, most current Australian history books have little on Timor and even less on the Timorese-Australian connection, focusing only on Australians. Now, to my great sorrow, this lack of information is also included in the school curriculum. In the 2013 history curriculum, mandated by the Australian government for history throughout right up to year 12, there is no mention of the Timor connection to Australia in World War II. The official Australian silence on the Timor campaign is reflected in the fairly miserable display on the topic in the War Memorial. I don't know whether you've seen it. There's a brass plaque on a pillar which says something about the Timor campaign, and there's a glass box in which resides the radio that the Australians made to notify the government of their presence. It's called Winnie the War Winner, and I think they've got that. That's about the extent of what's in our memorial about that magnificent support of those people for us. But as we know, there's one printed document from World War II which has come to symbolise the complex and ambiguous nature of the relationship between Australia and East Timor and the textual record of that relationship. It's the leaflet that was dropped over Timor, all over Timor, saying, "Your friends do not forget you." It's a badly presented document, complete with a spelling mistake in the heading, which suggests the opposite of remembering. They misspelled the Portuguese word for not. It symbolises the official Australian hubris and forgetfulness that has characterised the subsequent history, and represents much of the current written record of this wartime relationship. Inaccurate, self-serving, oblivious of the meaning of the war experience for the Timorese people. Now, remembering the Timorese support in World War II, of course, has presented governments of all persuasions with a terrible dilemma. How does one nation remember another when it was that other which lost tens of thousands of people as a result of the friendship? How can the remembering happen in the face of further betrayal, as in Australia's role in the Indonesian occupation from 1974? How could Australia have honoured the unique Timorese sacrifice while trying to rob them of their rightful share of the resources of the Timor Sea? Now friends, next year will be the 20th anniversary of the Timorese referendum and the welcome but belated arrival of the Interfect troops led by Sir Peter Cosgrove and the Australians. What fanfares will there be to spin the narrative into an Australian success? There was success. It can be claimed, and I claim it in my thesis, that there was a type of conversion, a type of Australian conversion towards the innocent victim, which we were all caught up in. You remember those marches? The Australian population saw the innocence of the Timorese, and we really got on board and made our government move. That's what happened. But truth-telling requires that we need to work to keep working together, so that that conversion is just not consigned to the pages of history. Now, I'm also conscious that in 2022, which is only 3 years away, it will be the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin, which of course is also the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Dili. Now, if the past is any example, the focus will be all on Australia. But these are two opportunities for us to tell the truth, friends. The War Memorial is becoming a national temple where all worship the increasingly marvellous Australian character. All drink from the stream of embellished war stories, seeing ever more clearly in their waters the contours of our courage, our resilience, our ingenuity, our lovable larrikin streak, or so we are led to believe. At the anniversaries, the war machine will be trundled out, and the shouting of Australian heroism, sacrifice, patriotism, gung-ho and daring-do, we all share the Anzac spirit, etc, 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 will fill the airwaves, the TV, social media, halls of parliament, schools, and I hate to say it, churches. The myth grows in proportion to the distance between us and the events. The dominant group is in the ascendancy. Lesser voices, like ours, no matter how true, are muted or deliberately silenced. But we can still tell the truth regarding these anniversaries and regarding people like Bernard Connelly, who is a living, breathing example of a present-day scapegoat. We can tell the truth together, and in so doing we can keep weakening the ancient lie of scapegoating, contributing to more lasting solutions to human violence than blaming the little one, the weak ones, and patting ourselves on the back. But friends, my parting comment is this: let us not stoop to the tactics of the victimisers. Telling the truth does not require name-calling, backbiting, venting the collective spleen. But it's so easy to fall into that scapegoating mechanism. I tell you, I do it a lot. It's part of the human condition. But I believe, with seeing what Gerard has written, it's been a type of conversion for me, I can tell you that. We can't afford to perpetuate the cycle of scapegoating by turning around and victimising the victimisers, because it just repeats the cycle. We are angry. Well, I'm angry about Bernard Connelly. He's a dear friend, and I am angry about that, and lots of people are angry. But let's channel that anger together into something positive, something that forms a fresh, courageous act of telling the truth. Thank you.